This is a companion video for my ebook on using the Sony a6700 for easy bird, wildlife, and nature photography. In this video, I'm just going to walk you quickly through setting up the modifications to program mode that I use. We'll begin with the main camera menu. We're going to set image quality recording. And your first choice is JPEG, HEIF, or RAW. I don't shoot in RAW, but I do use HEIF 422. Now, HEIF is a relatively new format. It's a high-efficiency compression algorithm that produces files half the size of a JPEG, but with equal or better quality. And I think they are slightly better. It's 10-bit as opposed to 8-bit. However, HEIF can't be viewed on some monitors, some computers, some laptops, and you'll get this warning if you choose it. You need a corresponding environment to use it. Now, if you're an Apple user, Apple deals with HEIF natively, and you shouldn't have any issue, but you still need to check to make sure that your particular editing software will read and edit HEIFs. If not, then you should set it to JPEG. When you've made that decision, then the rest of your menu will be translated to reflect that. So we're going to choose HEIF, extra fine, which will give you the most resolution, detail, and the least noise. And we're going to use the large size, well, all 26 megapixels of the sensor. And we're going to set the aspect ratio to 3:2, which is a native aspect of the a6700, and we'll again use all the pixels of the sensor. High ISO noise reduction, I leave that set to normal. And that's it for that menu. Then move down to drive mode. I set drive mode for continuous shooting low. You have several choices here. You have low, mid, high, and high plus. High plus is 11 frames per second. High is 8 to 10 frames per second. Mid is 7 to 8 frames per second. Low is 3 to 4 to 5 frames per second. I find that low works just fine for stationary birds and animals, and even animals that are preening or feeding actively. All I need is 4 to 5 frames per second. Otherwise, you come back with a lot of near duplicate images. Then we move down to shutter silent, silent mode settings. We turn silent mode on. It can be either on or off. Turning it on means the camera will use the electronic shutter and not the mechanical one. That produces less wear and tear on the camera over time, and it also doesn't disturb the wildlife. There are times, though, when you do need to use the mechanical shutter, and we will use it in our action and flight modifications. The electronic shutter produces some artifacts that can be disturbing to some people. When you're panning, it will slant the background, and it can distort the wings, rapidly moving wings of birds and insects. Target function settings. We're going to set aperture drive in AF to not target, and that's to enable a focus setting that we'll want to use later. And then we'll also set auto pixel mapping to not target. Release without lens. I disable that. I don't want the camera to take a picture if I don't have a lens mounted. And release without card especially, I disable that because I don't want to take pictures without knowing that I don't have a card in the camera. I've done that before. That's very disappointing. Then we'll move to image stabilization. Steady shot is Sony's internal stabilization. It's in-camera stabilization. And when you have a lens attached that has its own stabilization built in, like the Sony OSS lenses, or on the Tamron they're called VC, on some others they're called IS. You actually have to control whether steady shot is on or off with the switch on the lens. You'll notice if I switch image stabilization off on the lens, first it boots me back out of the menu. When I come back in, you'll see that it is now off. Putting the switch back on, and we're back to on. What I think is happening here is that steady shot is actually on when you turn it on the lens, but you just don't have any control over it. There are certain lenses now from Sony that do allow you to control steady shot with an OSS lens attached. But most lenses that have their own built-in stabilization, you turn steady shot on and off with the switch on the lens. Scroll down to zoom, scroll over to zoom range, set it for clear image zoom. Clear image zoom magnifies the center of the frame and uses sophisticated algorithms to retain as much detail as possible while giving you effectively twice your focal length. Moving then down to exposure. The first thing we're going to look at is ISO. We're going to set ISO to auto. Now we're going to scroll over and check our minimum ISO, which should be at 100, and our maximum ISO, which on this camera I set to 12,800. I find that images up to that show good detail still and not a lot of noise. Certainly not more noise than can be dealt with in software afterwards. You could go higher, but I leave that at 12,800. Your next option is ISO range limit. Now there are times when you will have to go higher than 12,800 to get even any kind of image at all. So I set a maximum ISO of 3200, which is a stop brighter than 12,800. Again, this goes all the way up to 102,400. But again, you'll get the best images below 3200. This one is important. Auto ISO minimum shutter speed. This tells the camera how low a shutter speed you're willing to accept. Now we're dealing with active animals and they might move as you're taking the shutter. Your image stabilization will certainly handle shots below 1/500th, but the birds and the animals just might not be still that long. So I set it to 1/500th. Alternatively, you could just move all the way up to the top of the scale and use this setting here, which is set at standard. Fast means that it will favor faster shutter speeds. Faster means it will favor even faster shutter speeds. But I leave it for birds and wildlife on 1/500th of a second. Now moving down to metering. You have lots of different metering mode choices. Multi divides the sensor into segments and does some complex math to try to figure out the best overall exposure to produce the most detail in highlights and shadows and the least noise. Center is useful sometimes when you want more emphasis on your subject. The one I use most besides multi, though, is highlight. Highlight protects the highlights, the brightest parts of the image, from burning out, from losing detail. And I use that when I'm shooting, for instance, white birds against a dark background. I actually have a button on the back of my camera programmed so that I can quickly change between multi and highlight. I leave it on multi for this custom memory, though. I set the spot metering point to focus point link. That means when I do use the highlight metering, it links the focus point and the exposure so that it's actually taking the exposure where the camera is focused. White balance I leave just on auto. Color tone. The first choice is your dynamic range optimizer. This is a feature of Sony cameras that attempts to balance the brightness and shadows in every image to produce the widest possible dynamic range. You have only two choices, auto and off. Under auto, you actually have choices of levels, but I just leave it on auto. Creative look. These are processing and exposure profiles that subtly change the look of the finished image when you're shooting in JPEG or in HEIF. You have lots of choices here. None of them, however, were designed for birds and wildlife. So I start with the ST profile, or creative look, which is the one that is designed for the widest range of possible situations and subjects. And then I go in and I make a few changes to bring out the detail that I want in the feathers and the fur. So you see many things you can change. Fade is actually a kind of a negative contrast. Saturation. I set sharpness 2 up to 6. And I set sharpness range all the way up to 5. You can see it's normally at 3. This tells the camera to apply the sharpening to finer edges like feathers and fur. I set clarity up 1 to 2. Clarity is something like what we might call micro contrast. It defines the edges in the photograph. If you set this too high, then you begin to get a chiseled look, and you lose detail in the highlights and the shadows. So we keep it fairly low, but give it a little boost for fur and feathers. And that's it. Picture profile does apply to still pictures, but it is more useful when you're shooting video. That brings us to autofocus, manual focus. That brings us to the autofocus, manual focus menu. The first thing we're going to set is the focus mode. I use continuous autofocus. Priority set in autofocus single, leave that unbalanced. Priority set in autofocus continuous, I also leave that unbalanced. That means that the camera makes a decision as to whether to actually take the picture depending on the situation. I could set it to autofocus, in which case the camera would not take a picture unless the image was in focus. I could set it to release, which means that it would take a picture every time I press the shutter release, whether it was focused or not. Or balanced emphasis, again, allows the camera to sense and decide which is more appropriate. AF tracking sensitivity, I set that to responsive. Now the choices here are from 1 to 5. 1 is locked on. That means once it determines what you're tracking, it will not let go. Standard is kind of a little more flexible. Responsive means that, especially for birds in flight and active wildlife, if it loses focus, it will seek another subject to focus on. Aperture drive in autofocus. We're going to set that to focus priority. The cost here is that in focus priority, the aperture motor is a little bit louder, but the focus is quicker. I turn on full-time DMF. Now, only some lenses will allow you to set this to on. When you do, that means that the focus ring on your lens will override the autofocus whenever you touch it. That can be very useful, especially with subject recognition, when you need to quickly move the focus in order to help the camera find your subject. Focus area, again, very important, especially if you're using focus recognition, because often you need to help the camera to find your subject in the frame. We'll start here with focus area limit. Now, I don't use most of these focus areas. I use wide. I don't use zone. I do use center fixed. I don't use spot small, spot medium, or spot large, but I do use expanded flexible spot. I don't, for stationary birds and animals, use any of the tracking options. Then I go back up here to focus area and I set it to wide. That's where I start. Scroll down to autofocus continuous area display and make sure that's turned on. Phase detect area I set to off. That eliminates all the little green dancing squares that can be very distracting in your view. Circulation of focus point, I set it to circulate, and that's because I set a button on the camera to change focus points. And with this set to circulate, pressing the button moves it one step, two steps through the set of focus areas that I've already designated. Now we come to the real magic, subject recognition. First, we're going to turn subject recognition in autofocus on. And then we're going to restrict our set of targets by unchecking the ones we won't use. Now, I actually don't use animal or bird. I find that animal bird works better than either animal or bird, no matter what you're trying to focus on. I don't use car, train, or airplane, and that's it. Now we go back up to recognition target. And I set animal bird as my base setting for this set of modifications to program. If we go back in here, you will see the little arrows pointing to the right. What they open is the detailed settings for each of these. Recognition priority set, I set it on birds. That means when there's a bird and an animal in the same frame, it will give slight priority to the birds. And that's just me, that's the way I work. Recognition part, you have choices here. I turn it on eye, head, body, so that if it can't find the eye, it'll focus on the head. If it can't find the head, it'll focus on the body. Then you have detailed settings for both animal and bird. I set the tracking shift range set on standard. That controls how far away from your actual focus area the subject can be without it losing focus. Tracking persistence, just to be confusing, they have reversed this so that now 1 is not locked on and 5 is locked on. I move it to 4. Recognition sensitivity, I turn it all the way up to high. And we still have this set for that. Then we go back and we'll go back to bird settings. And basically I do the same thing here. Now I arrived at these settings through a good deal of experimentation. And as I said, I found that leaving it on animal bird actually gives you quicker focus and more reliable focus than putting it on either animal or bird. Now I do change my detail settings for insects, mainly changing recognition sensitivity to high. I don't select it because I leave it, as I said, in animal bird, and then I program a button on the camera to change quickly between animal bird and insect. That's why I can have just one set of modifications for stationary birds and wildlife and one set for action and flight, because I have this little programmed button that allows me to switch quickly between my subjects. Subject recognition frame display, I turn that to on, so that it puts a little little green box around the place where it actually is attempting to focus. And except for setting my custom buttons, that is the complete set of modifications that I make to program. So we come now to setting the custom buttons. That's in the toolbox menu. If you scroll over and down to Operation Customize, the first thing you see is Camera Custom Key Dial Set. If you open that, that gives you a map of all the different buttons that are available on the a6700. We begin with the buttons on the rear of the camera. Button number 1 is actually kind of on the side of the camera. It's hard to reach with the thumbs or fingers of your right hand, so I don't program anything that I use very often to it. There is a feature, though, on the a6700 called Clear Image Zoom that I use sometimes. It actually uses sophisticated algorithms to enlarge the center of the frame and to increase the effective focal length of your lens by 1 to 2 times. It can come in handy when your subject is just too far away. To find it, open button number 1, scroll all the way to the left to your camera menu, scroll over and down to number 7, zoom, and turn zoom on. I leave button number 2 to back button autofocus. Button number 3, though, the trash can, I reprogram to turn on and off silent mode. Again, to do that, you need to be in the camera menu and then scroll down to shutter silent 5 and then over to silent switch mode and select that. Then the second set of options is for the 4 buttons on the 5-way control wheel on the back. I leave the first 3 as they are: focus standard, drive mode, and ISO. And then I change number 4, which is originally set to exposure compensation, which you already have on a dial. And I set it to metering mode, which again is in the exposure menu, and number 3 in the exposure menu, metering, and then metering mode. Then when I press that bottom of the wheel, it'll open the metering mode and allow me to use the wheel itself to quickly select highlight when I need it, and then to go back to multi when I'm not using highlight. The buttons on the top of the camera, I leave number 1 set to movie shooting, but I set number 2 to recognition target select. That's in the autofocus, manual focus menu, number 3 subject recognition, and then scrolling over you'll see recognition target select. Set it to that. Then pressing that button will quickly circulate between the recognition targets that you have in your set, in my case between animal, bird, and insect. The next button is the focus hold button on the lens. Now, on the Tamron lens I have, you need to use the Tamron app in order to turn on the ability to set this button from the camera. Once you've done that, then you can go and set it. And again, this isn't autofocus, manual focus again. You're going to go to focus area and then switch focus area. That way, pressing the focus hold button on the lens will cycle through the different focus areas that you have set, so you can quickly and easily change to a smaller area or a larger area as you need it. Finally, the front dial I leave set to exposure compensation, and then I set dial number 2, which is the dial on the top of the camera next to the main control dial, to aperture, and that's under exposure. And then scroll over until you see aperture. That turns it into an effective program shift dial. It allows me to change the aperture as I need to for more depth of field or to force a slower or higher shutter speed as needed in the situation. And I leave the dial around the 5-way control wheel set to no particular action. And that's it. Those are my custom modifications to program mode that I use for stationary, birds, wildlife, and insects. In order to save those to memory, you need to scroll back up to your main camera menu. Scroll over and down to shooting mode. I don't exactly know why it's called shooting mode, but it is. Scroll over one more and down to camera set memory. Set those modifications to memory number 1. And there you have it. Memory number 1 is now your modifications to program mode for relatively stationary birds, wildlife, and insects. Now, to create your action and flight modifications, we begin with the set we've already created and just go back and make a few changes. So set your main control dial to memory 1. Open your menu. Go down to camera menu. Go to drive mode. We're going to change the drive mode from continuous shooting low to continuous shooting mid. That'll give me more frames per second and a better chance of catching active birds and wildlife in flight. Go back, go to shutter silent, and here we're going to turn silent shutter off. That forces the camera to use the mechanical shutter, which will eliminate the rolling shutter effects, the slanted backgrounds when panning, and the distortion in rapidly moving wings. Then we move on to exposure. And again, we're going to leave it in ISO auto and the same range limits, but now we're going to change our minimum shutter speed. And we're either going to set it to 2000, which will allow us to capture birds in flight, most birds in flight. Hummingbird wings takes a 4000th, but 2000 is good for most action and flying birds. But I like to set it up here under the top setting just to faster. That means the camera will pick 1/2000th most of the time, but it has some leeway on either side so that if the situation arises, it can pick a faster shutter speed or a slightly slower shutter speed in order to capture the action. The next changes are in the autofocus manual focus area. And the change we're going to make is in the focus area section. We're going to change our focus area limits. In this case, we're going to use the same basic functions, but we're going to use the tracking variety. Center fixed and expanded spot. And then we can turn off the standard variety of wide, center fixed, and expanded spot. I leave this on tracking wide to begin with, but then I can switch with the focus hold button on the lens to select either center fixed or expanded spot. Subject recognition, we don't need to make any changes because we have that little button programmed on top of the camera to do the switch between animal, bird, and insect on the fly. And that's it. Those are the changes you need to make in order to create your action flight program modifications. So then we can just move back up to the camera menu, scroll over and down to shooting mode, scroll down to camera memory set, and we're going to set that to memory 2. If you save it to memory 1, you will have overwritten your set of modifications for birds, wildlife, and insects. So make sure you set it to a different memory, in this case, memory 2. Now we're going to create our custom memory for inanimate macros. I can use, of course, the bird, wildlife, and insect settings for macros of birds, wildlife, and insects. But occasionally I want to take a picture of a flower or a mushroom or some other subject. So for that, I have a custom memory. Begin with the main control dial set in custom memory 1. Then we're going to make just a couple of changes. Go to drive mode. Set drive mode to single shooting. Under autofocus, we're going to go over to subject recognition, and we're going to turn subject recognition off. Scroll over, down to shooting mode, camera memory set, and I set that to memory 3. And there you have it. 3 sets of modifications to program, which make it possible for you to quickly and easily shoot almost anything you're going to want to take a picture of with your a6700.